Hey y'all, my name is Billy Thomas and I am the Chief Data Officer at ALLJOY Data. And today we're going to answer the question, why is data quality sometimes so difficult to get out of a system? And in particular, we're going to look at SAP and we're going to look at a SAP object called routings or recipes, task lists they're sometimes called. And that's part of the difficulty of this particular issue is you've got the same tables referring to multiple different objects, and we're going to go through that in detail. By the end of this video, you're going to see one of the most complex objects and how we handle it, and we'll show you the joins, talk about the functions, and some of the functional knowledge that was needed to get to the bottom of this customer request. Let's get to work. I am sitting in SAP here on my screen to describe to you what just happened at our client site and sort of the journey we went on to come up with a data quality report for this client. We were in one of our normal working sessions where we're going through the data and the requirements for the data quality reports when our team lead asked what seemed to be a very simple request, and on the surface it is. He said, when I'm working with recipes, when we look at a recipe, we need to make sure that there's machine time on every recipe. In other words, they wanted to see that one of these values, and on the screen here, you'll see there's standard value 1, standard value 2, and there's actually 6 different standard values that can be configured in SAP for a resource. Now, here's part of the challenge. Because these parameters are configurable, you actually have to go to each one of the work centers, look up that parameter, and find out if that parameter has been set to machine time. So we have to look at the parameter on the work center of the routing or recipe to see if it is actually configured. Now, I actually have a PowerPoint to help us follow along, and we're going to answer the question for why in the world are some data quality reports so complex, right? Why is it that you give a requirement to somebody in the data team and it might take them a week or so to come back with it, or they might come back and say it's impossible. And I can tell you that I've been in more than one client when it comes to BOMs and routings and SAP, they just sort of throw up their hands because the data model is too complex, and we're going to get into that. Let's go to look at sort of the data flow here. And it's really important that if you're working as a data analyst, that you start getting real comfortable with the fact that you're going to need some business knowledge, you're going to need some functional knowledge about the system you're working on. That's why we're starting in SAP. I'm looking at the data objects that I'm going to be needing to get the answers for in a data quality report. I don't want to just look at the tables. I don't want to just look at the fields in the tables and the columns and the data types. I want to actually look at what the client's looking at and get into that end user system so that I understand a little bit about what's going on, and then I can actually verify the results of my report on my own before I throw it over the fence to my customer. So if I look at this, I have a recipe pulled up, and we're looking at the standard value of 1 in standard value 1, and there's 1 in standard value 2. And if we want to know what does that mean, we have to go over to this resource. Now let me just pause for just a second here. Some of this that I'm telling you is knowledge that I've obtained by working with SAP since 1997, right? So not everybody's going to have that knowledge. So you may actually end up having to work with other people or work with a consulting firm to help you get to some of these answers. But I know in working with resources and work centers that these values are on the resource. So if I double click the resource, then that takes me to what is on the screen right here is a standard value key. That standard value key now says if you put something in the first parameter, that's machine. If you put it in the second parameter, that is labor. All right, so the basic flow of the data Starts with the recipe, goes to the resource, goes to a standard value key, and then ends up into a parameter, and that parameter is going to tell us what those numbers mean back here on the recipe screen. Because remember, all we see here is it says standard value number 1, standard value number 2. It doesn't really tell us at this point on the recipe whether it's machine, whether it's labor, or whatever. Okay, so if we've got that, right, and we were seeing that data on the screen, that data has to be stored somewhere in the underlying system. And again, through experience and also some research, especially on this particular one, because we needed to go a couple levels deeper in recipes than I've ever needed to go before, we did some Google searching and some testing and discovery with SAP Tables to come up with the data model that was going to be required. Now these, somebody's like, well, what are the tables, right? So if you're working with Material Master, you say, oh, I want to work with MARA, right, which is the Material Basic table. And you just query that table and you've got it. Well, if we want to get to answering any question about a standard value or like machine time or setup time, we've got to use all of these tables plus some functions plus some filtering to get to that answer. And I'm going to walk you through that a little bit, but let me just start right here. This table MAPL, that's like a header where the material is actually tied to the recipe. PLPO, PLAS, PLPO are the main task list tables. Now, you've already heard me say it, but I'll say it again. SAP will use PLPO, PLKO, and PLAS to store multiple task list types. And let me just shove over to the next slide here so that you can see that. These task list types are, some of them are for production, some of them are for plant maintenance, some of them for quality management, but they all end up in these tables PLPO, PLKO, and PLAS. So once again, you've got to have a little bit of functional knowledge about the system to know what you're going after. If you're going after a recipe, there's a field in those tables called task list type, and we're going to limit it to task list type 2. Right? Back when I was a plant maintenance functional consultant, we worked with general task lists, equipment task lists, and functional location task lists. And those task lists were A, E, and T respectively. And so that's one of the very first things that we have to sort of wrestle with in dealing with a complex request like this from the client is we've got to understand, a little bit of functional knowledge. We've got to get, going back to the tables. What are the tables? Where are the tables? Right? Some of these tables I just knew off the top of my head. Some of them I had to use the SAP help system. Some of them I've got sort of leads by doing some Googling out on the internet. But in the end, I had to get into the specific tables, and you can't find documentation like what you're seeing on my screen right now. At least I haven't found anywhere on the internet. And so you've got to either watch a video like this or get some information from Google or figure it out on your own. What are the joins? Is it an inner join? Is it an outer join? How does the data work together? Right? So in the end, let me go back to this. We had recipe. So recipe was this MAPL, PLKO, PLAS, and PLPO. We had that going to a resource. The resource comes off of PLPO, which is where the operations are on the recipe. And again, just so that you understand what I'm saying, the operations are these line items, these detail lines on the recipe. Over here, if I just open that up, and again, SAP, you gotta love it. It says operation or phase, and then it's also labeled as activity, right? But it means the same thing. And then, so that's where the PLPO is. And then inside of those items, you have resources, which are also called work centers in some of the task list types, and the tables behind The resources are CRHD for the header and CRTX for the description of the resource. And then once we're into the resource, I'm going to just double click it. That'll take me to the resource screen. I need to get down to the standard value key, which is here. This is YBP1, right? And that table is TC21. And then if I go into TC, if I want to see the actual parameters, which are these things down here where it says, I'm going to move this just a little bit, where it says standard values overview, or for the standard value key, you can have up to 6 of them, and they would be listed out right here so that we can see how they're configured. Now, I'm just going to show you real quick because it's not voodoo magic. It's rows and columns of data, right? So let's keep this guy in mind right here, this YBP1. If I go into SAP, and I actually rented an SAP system to make this video so that I could help you, because I've never come across any documentation like this out there. And so I really want to help the next generation of data analysts, especially in the SAP data quality area, to have a little bit of knowledge around SAP and working with data quality. And so if I go to SE16N, which is just a transaction in SAP that allows me to display data in a table, and I pull up these different tables, like I was mentioning, like TC21 is the standard value key, and we look at that, you'll see that there's rows and columns of data. The rows are the standard value keys. I can't remember exactly. I think it was YBP1 was the one we were looking at. And then, yeah, you'll see that there are 2 parameters, SAP02 and SAP03, that have been configured for that standard value key. And then if we go to TC20, we'll see how those 2 particular parameters were configured to be. So I believe it was SAP02. Was that right? Nope, it was these guys, SAP_02 and SAP_03. That's where our machine and labor come from. So to recap, we went from, and let me do it from the SAP screen here, and we'll go back to a recipe. So give me just a second. We're just backing up here. So /n, so new transaction C203. This is the recipe we were working with. I'm in the recipe right now. The header, PLPO, and then there's this interim table, which is PLAS, that connects the header to the detail, right? And we're going to get into it, but there's reasons why there's an interim table. Some of those reasons have to do with change history, so that SAP can keep track of for validation and other SOX type requirements for large corporations. They have to keep all the history of what's happened to the recipes, routings, bill of materials, that type of thing. And so there's this table that manages if something's been deleted or changed, and there's an interim between the header and the detail, and that's PLAS. And then down here is the actual PLPO information of the operations. And then from there, we get to the resource, which is here. This resource is, oops, sorry, we're going to cancel that. I muted the computer, but didn't mute my phone. How about that? But when we get to this resource, we see the standard value key. This standard value key was TC21, and then these actual parameters down here in the table that's where it says standard values overview, that is the TC20 values. So there you have it. When we go to this guy right here, we're now making the correlation in our mind between what we see on the screen, what's behind the scenes in the tables. Now, it's really important to understand at this point that we came across some really complicated intricacies of routings and recipes when we were working with them. And it was for this particular client, but you can see that this data model would work for any client because of the way that SAP set up the tables. And let me go back to the PowerPoint and let me just walk you through a few of the specific things that we discovered. One is that there's a difference between even recipes and routings, even though they're used in production, right? So they're in the same functional area, but the way that they're used is different. So for example, recipes have phases, and there's actually a column in the PLPO table that says phase flag. Well, if you're working with a routing, it doesn't matter. Like, there is no phase flag on a routing. So, you know, the type of task list that you're working with will actually change the way you go after data inside of the tables. And so if I go back here to, and I'm going to keep jumping back to SAP because you have to understand, again, the functional side to relate it to the detailed technical side. What I'm looking for is you know, when it says 10 hours or 1 hour, I'm actually looking for, because I've been asked by the customer, like, I'm looking for, is one of these guys a machine, right? Is it one of these machine time, right? And so if you look at PLPO, and I don't want to get the detail in this video too drawn out, but if I go look at PLPO, you can trust me and verify this in your own SAP system. For this particular operation that's marked as a phase, this work center that shows on the screen does not show up in the table information. What does show up in the table information is that this is a flag that belongs to operation 10. And in operation 10, you can get the resource. So you have to go from, when you're working with a recipe and you have a phase, you have to go from the phase to the operation and then get the resource and then drill down into TC21 and TC20 to get to whether, you know, these values over here are going to be machine time. Let's talk about a couple other things that we found. If an operation on a routing is created with a reference routing, you must use the reference fields to go back to the reference routing to get something like the work center again. And so it's not something you can just join together. Both rows of data are in PLPO. It's just that the operation you're looking at has pointers that point to the reference routing that says, in the reference routing, this is your work center. And so you have to either use a function or you have to use a nested SQL query to take the current key that you're on, go to the reference routing, get the information from that reference routing, and bring it back to display to the user on your report. Again, this is probably the most complex data quality report I've ever worked on. The bill of material is right up there, but routings, it may take the cake. In addition to the phases and dealing with reference routings, you've got to make sure you deal with deleted records. You have to make sure you deal with the fact that SAP uses change management and therefore has historical records in PLPO. And so there are manipulations that you have to do to the keys between PLKO to PLAS to get to the right records in PLPO to bring those back to the users. And one other thing, and this is still in my mind a sort of a debate item, and yes, even though I've worked with the data for 20 years, I do not make adamant statements about things that I may not be sure of. So this next statement, it appears to me to be true, but it looks like routings and recipes cannot have valid from dates that are future dated, which is very different from bill of materials. And so in three or four systems that I looked at, there was only one record that I found in PLPO that was future dated, and it was a task list type that was for quality management inspection plans. the research that I did on the web and the poking around I did in SAP, I do not see any way in a recipe or routing where you can future date a change on the recipe or routing. Now, I would love if you have the knowledge to educate me about the future dating of routings and recipes. I would love for you to leave that in the comments, because I am a continual learner. As much as I want to pass on information to you, I'd love to learn from you as well. Now, we've got all that sort of background. What does that lead us to? What, at some point, you've got to write some code, right? And I'm going to give you just a visual of, and I don't expect that you can read this. That's not the point. The point is to show you there's like 300 lines of SQL. This happens to be SQL that was written in GCP, but we've not only done it in GCP, we've done it in SQL. But the idea behind it is you've got to get the joins right. You've got to create functions or nested queries to deal with phases or reference routings. You got to make sure you filter out deleted records. You got to deal with historical records. And so if somebody asks you for a data quality report for routings, you might want to tell them it's going to take a little bit of time, or you might want to say, hey, why don't you give ALLJOY Data a call or send them an email, because that one might be something that we need to get some consulting help for. Hey, I hope you've enjoyed this video. And again, if you have something that you can add to the knowledge that I'm sharing, I would love to hear from you. Also would love to hear from you if there are other videos that you might like to see that would be helpful as you pursue your career or are serving your clients in the data quality realm. And with that, I'm going to just say have a great day and God bless. Take care.